We're still not done with configuring or with discussing all of the configurations that we will find within Liferay. For one, there's the different application suites that we have, and they all bring their own configuration. Many of them just on the content side, some of them for you as a DevOps person for configuration within the running system. We have several scopes that you should look at, that you should explore for yourself. There's the system scope, there's the individual sites scope, and then we have the individual application scope. Now, for DevOps, we don't need to know too much about sites, but I just want to tell you the very basics about sites, because you might wonder where are those settings and why is somebody talking about a default setting that I'm not aware of. In an earlier video, I recommended to sit down with somebody from the content team to explain what a site is. Now I've reconsidered and I'm going to explain just a little bit about sites and what they do. So for one, if you have a full system scope, this is for everything that runs on Liferay. For example, our MIME types. If you say that AVI is a video and WAV is an audio file, that will be everywhere. It doesn't make any difference whatsoever where this is configured, which of the individual sites. Now consider you build an intranet site with Liferay DXP and consider it a larger company. You might have one site for just the accounting, one site for the marketing, and one site for sales. This is typically then department by department by department. So you want to make sure that only certain people can read or write in their respective department. So we can build a site just for accounting, a site just for marketing, a site for sales. And within sites, it's very easy to define members for this site, and it's easy to define permissions within this site. And that's the natural buckets that I like to say for any kind of Liferay content. If you are within a site, you can grant somebody some access. That will just be true within the accounting site, but not within the marketing site, for example. And they will all have their own articles, their own blog articles, their own images, their own documents that you upload with the site's permissions. So if you configure something system-wide, that's one of the options that you have. But if you configure something site-wide, naturally you first got to choose the site and then configure that site. Another example, we've been through that a little bit earlier, is the languages. If you say my global languages are English, Spanish, French, I'll say that from a European background, sorry for those from the Asian country as well, but choose any of the languages that you support within your intranet and make them available system-wide. Now, if you have the German accounting department, you might want to limit that to certain languages, just to the company's default language and German, for example. And that's a setting that you do site by site by site. And the same thing is what you can have in this default configuration for all site or an individual site configuration. You can provide the defaults and then you can override the defaults in different areas. Go to Control Panel, System Settings for global settings, and then go to Sites, the individual site, to that configuration for the site's settings. Next up, a chapter on determining what can you do with the config files. I told you it's the easiest to create the config files on the user interface. Do you always need to go back to the user interface? No. You can download them and open them in any text editor and override them there, change them, edit them in a text editor. Important is that you keep the name and that you keep the keys in that file. It's properties like, keep the keys the same and then change the values in there. When you deploy a config file to any other instance, you can just drop it in Liferay's deploy folder. This is discussed a couple of slides later. or you can just drop it in the OSGI configs folder. And reminder, keep the name. And when you do so, when you deploy a config file in one of the instances, it will be persisted in the database, which is available to every cluster machine, and every cluster machine will pick up that configuration. Not so much a configuration, but just, well, it matches here to mention that a little bit. As we have said, there are application suites. How do you find more application suites or just simple applications? Go to Liferay's Marketplace. Not only do you find third-party there, you'll also find a couple of applications that are distributed by Liferay, but they don't come with a core. So you can find new features, new components, new themes, or other application suites that are not delivered by default, but that you can add from Marketplace. Marketplace is available in your control panel, so go ahead, sign in to Marketplace, which is your liferay.com account, and you can hot deploy, install right from there. Now, hot deploy, good keyword here. What's hot deploy? Question up front. When you deploy new components through the user interface, for example, from Marketplace, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a very flexible way to configure, to deploy new components. It's kind of countering our efforts to use Docker and images that contain all of the code that you want to have. Yes, you can have the OSGI folder in a volume. The OSGI folder is where all of the applications are deployed to, or you just keep them within the container, but then they're not persistent over restarts. Well, let's say hot deploy is really interesting to try out new features, to be in the development environment, but if you go truly DevOps and truly with images and with reproducible containers, you want to download the files from Marketplace, the applications from Marketplace, and weave them into your own images, your own Docker files, and deploy from there. Nevertheless, it's important to know the hot deploy mechanics, because it might help you to just quick fix something by adding something to the hot deployed environment and then fix it later in the proper Docker image. You can deploy two kinds of applications. One is the so-called module, which is an OSGI-based application, typically consisting of many different modules that you deploy at once. And another one is a so-called WAR file, where WAR is a web application archive. And this is I would say the legacy way of deploying applications on Liferay, but it still works. It's based on the specification. We've got to be able to deploy a new web application in Liferay, and that will work. Will work? How does it work? Liferay has one folder that it always monitors, which is the so-called deploy folder. And the slide says the name is Liferay home/deploy. What's Liferay home? That's the directory, the root directory of your bundle, for example. It's typically one directory up from your application server. And physically, the default name for it is actually deploy. And any module, any WAR file that you drop there will be picked up by the runtime, deployed to the application server, provided there are proper permissions on the file system, and then removed from the deploy folder. So if you have this deploy folder, if you monitor the deploy folder, it will typically be empty. If there's anything in the deploy folder lying around for quite a while, that points to a problem with your setup. And you can typically figure out what is my problem by looking at the log file. It's often a missing deployment descriptor, it's a wrong version of a module, or it's just missing permissions on the OSGI modules folder where it will be deployed, so it will be physically copied over. That being said, how do you change the deploy folder? Portal properties to the rescue. Remember, you're not portal X properties, portal-ext properties. This is where you can configure any of these settings. auto.deploy.enabled equals true. That's the standard. You don't need to configure that. And then the deploy directory is liferay home/deploy. That's what happens anyways. And approximately every 3 seconds, the directory gets inspected and everything that's there will be deployed, if everything goes right. And that's just important to know, because in a Docker environment, I would say this is not the standard way to deploy, but it's a quick way to be able to deploy, to try out new components, or to overwrite something until the next run of or until the next update of the Docker file. It is the mechanic that it is the way that will be used with any marketplace deployments. If you just hot deploy from the marketplace, you'll say, well, I'd like to install this. That's exactly the way that it gets deployed. I've covered system settings a little bit earlier. System settings, system-wide or instance-wide. They are the settings that you have already seen in control panel under system settings, some under instance setting, that I won't cover that much here, but just how do you migrate them between the two? Well, we have seen that with a document library exercise. You can change the settings on one system, download the config file and hot deploy it on another system. Hot deploy it or weave it into the Docker image. So you can use it to create your new Docker image and then start that new system, or you can use it in a hot deploy fashion by just deploying that config file. You can upload through the user interface, you can put it into the hot deploy folder or just in the OSGI configs folder. That just works. And as it says here, removing a config file restores the previous default values for the storage of Liferay's document library. Well, this is going back to the exercise. Typically, if you remove a config file, the settings get reverted. And what you can also discover on the user interface, once you have changed a setting, the user interface will tell you this is an explicit setting, this is configured, or it will tell you this has never been configured, these are the default values. And this is also where you can revert back to the default values. The next exercise will show you more about changing changing values, exporting them to another system, and will prepare you for an example or for an exercise that we have in clustering. What are we doing? We are exporting the file system storage in one of the systems and then transferring them to the Wildfly instance. So anything that you configure, you'll update the file system storage in system settings, export them, copy them over to the Wildfly configs directory, and there you will see the configuration is active, and then you can restore it there to the default values. And you should check that this is actually valid. Now, what will you see here? We are going to change configuration for the advanced file system store. Have we configured the Wildfly server to use the advanced file system store? No, we haven't. So what's the point? Well, the point is we can now demonstrate some configuration that won't be used, but we can actually inspect that it's correctly changed and then revert it back to the defaults. So change these settings, move them to the other server, validate that they arrive at the other server, that they are active at the other server, and then you can revert back. And during the clustering exercise, we will see how to actually make use of the advanced file system configuration or the advanced file system store. This exercise will tell Liferay where the advanced file system store would store its documents, but we haven't activated advanced file system store. So once we activate advanced file system store, it would actually be the directory where documents are shared and stored. Until we do so, it's a configuration just for itself. Okay, wind up, ready, set, and go.